The morning they buried Thomas Bishop, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas, was the color of a bruise that refused to heal, and Maria Bishop stood at the graveside in her black wool dress with her hands folded so tightly together that her knuckles had gone the shade of bleached bone. And she did not cry, not once, not even when the preacher said the final words, and the dirt fell heavy and final onto the pine box that held what remained of the only man she had ever loved. That was October of 1873, and the town of Caldwell was a rough and weathered place, a cattle town that sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, where the drovers came through with their longhorns and their thirst and their gambling money. And it was not a town built for soft things, not for grief that lingered past its welcome, not for widows who had no family left to stand beside them at the graveside. The preacher's wife had brought a casserole dish and left it on the porch without knocking. The banker's wife had nodded from across the street with the particular expression of a woman who felt sorry, but was relieved the tragedy had not touched her own house. The neighbors had done what neighbors do, which is to say they had done just enough to say they had done something, and then they had gone back to their own lives and left Maria Bishop to the great silence of hers. She was 27 years old. She had come to Caldwell 3 years prior as a new bride, following Thomas West from her family's home in Ohio, full of the particular hope that young women carry into marriages in the way they carry hope into most things, openly, completely, without reservation. Thomas had been a good man. He had been a cattle broker, working the margins between the drovers and the buyers, and he had been building something, a life, a house, a future. He had been 31 years old and full of plans, and then a fever had come through in the September heat like a thief that does not announce itself. And in 6 days it had taken him from a living, breathing man full of plans to a cold thing in a pine box, and Maria was left standing in the small clapboard house on the edge of town with $200 in a tin box, a milk cow, a kitchen garden, and nothing else. She wore her grief quietly. That was the thing people said about her, though they said it less with admiration than with a kind of uncomfortable respect, the way people admire something they do not want to look at directly. She did not wail. She did not take to her bed. She did not drink. She went to the market on Tuesdays and the church on Sundays, and she nodded to people when they nodded to her, and she took on laundry work to supplement what the kitchen garden brought in, and she did all of this with a composure so complete that it made the other women of Caldwell vaguely uneasy, as if grief properly worn should be louder, more visible, more easily categorized and put away. The truth was that Maria Bishop's grief was not quiet because it was small. It was quiet because it was enormous, because it had taken up every inch of space inside her and pressed out against her ribs and sat heavy on her sternum, and made the mornings the particular kind of terrible that no one tells you about before you lose someone, the way you wake up for just 1/2 second not remembering, and then you remember, and the whole thing happens to you again fresh and complete. She kept it inside because she had no one to give it to. The town had left her to it, and she had accepted that this was simply the way things were, and she told herself that she did not mind, and some days she almost believed it. Isaiah Walker arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in late March of 1874, 5 months after Thomas Bishop went into the ground, and he arrived the way most men arrived in Caldwell, which was on horseback and trailing dust. He was 29 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had worked hard ground most of his life, with dark eyes that had the quality of still water, deep and calm and difficult to read. He had a worn leather hat that had seen better decades, and a bay horse named Copper that he treated with the careful consideration that some men reserve for people they love. He had come from Texas, having spent the better part of the past 6 years working cattle drives up the Kishom Trail, but he was not a drover anymore, not precisely. He had a small sum of money saved, enough to start something if the something was modest, and he had the kind of tiredness that is not physical tiredness, but the tiredness of a life that has been all motion and no roots, and he had come to Caldwell because a man he'd worked cattle with 3 seasons back had told him the land outside town was good, and the price was reasonable, and sometimes that is all a person needs to make a decision. He took a room at Harmon's boarding house on the main street, and the next morning he walked through the town the way a man walks through a town he is considering, which is slowly and with his eyes open. He went to the general store run by a man named Griggs who had opinions about everything and kept them to himself only under duress. He went to the land office and spoke with the county agent about the parcels available east of the creek. He ate supper at the saloon's back room where they served beans and cornbread for a nickel, and the whiskey was cheaper than the water, and he drank neither because he was a man who kept his head clear. And on his second afternoon in Caldwell, he walked past the small clapboard house on the edge of town and saw a woman in a black dress hanging laundry on a line in the side yard, and something about the set of her shoulders made him slow down. He could not have said precisely what it was. She was not performing sadness, which is what made it so visible to him. She was simply living inside it, hanging sheets with efficient, careful movements, her dark hair pinned back beneath a black bonnet, and there was something in the economy of her movements, the way she held herself together so completely, that struck him the way certain landscapes strike certain people, as if he recognized something without knowing how it was that he knew it. He did not stop. He walked on, but he thought about those shoulders for the rest of the afternoon. He found out about her the way you find out about everyone in a small town, which is by accident and in pieces. The boarding house landlady, Mrs. Harmon, was a woman of strong informational tendencies, and over breakfast on his third morning she told him, without particular preamble, that the widow Bishop was a decent woman in a hard situation, that she had come from good Ohio stock, that her husband had died of fever the previous fall, and that she was managing, as she put it, with a composure that some people found admirable and others found unsettling, and that she suspected the woman was lonely beyond what anyone in town was willing to see. Isaiah ate his biscuit and said very little, which was his custom, but he listened. A week after his arrival, he purchased the parcel east of the creek, 40 acres of decent grassland with a small creek running through it, and a sod house that would need work but would serve until he could build something better. He acquired 2 horses beyond copper, 3 head of cattle to start a small herd, and a plow, and he set to work with the patient, methodical energy of a man who has decided on a direction. The work was hard and the days were long, and Caldwell was slowly becoming familiar to him, the rhythms of it, the faces that went with the names, the particular social geography of a cattle town. He saw Maria Bishop at the market on the second Tuesday after his arrival. She was selecting potatoes with the careful attention of a woman who is managing money closely, turning each one over in her hands, and she did not see him until he was standing 2 feet away. And when she looked up, she had that quality of a person who has been very far away in their own thoughts and has returned just quickly enough to manage their face before anyone could see where they had been. "Pardon me," he said, because he had reached past her for the bin of dried beans and had come close enough to startle her. "It's all right," she said. Her voice was low and even and had a composure in it that matched everything else about her. "Isaiah Walker," he said, because it seemed the thing to do. "I have the land east of the creek." She looked at him for a moment with the measured assessment of a woman who has learned to take the measure of strangers. "Maria Bishop," she said, "I'm on the west edge of town." "I know," he said, and then regretted it because it sounded as if he had been asking after her, which in a manner of speaking he had. She did not seem troubled by it. "Mrs. Harmon," she said, and it was not a question. "She is thorough," he agreed. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile but the architecture of one, the suggestion of what a smile might look like if it decided to fully arrive. "She is," Maria said, and then she paid for her potatoes and her dried beans and her small portion of salt pork, and she left, and Isaiah stood in the general store for a moment longer than necessary before he paid for his own supplies. That was how it began. It began slowly, and it began in the margins of ordinary life, the way most true things begin. He saw her at church on Sunday. Caldwell had a Presbyterian congregation that met in a wooden building that was also used on weekdays as a schoolhouse. And the preacher was a gaunt man named Reverend Holt, who had a good heart and a tendency toward very long sermons. Maria sat 3 rows from the front on the left side, as she apparently always did, and Isaiah sat near the back because he was new, and because that is what you do when you are new. He watched her the way he watched everything, quietly and with his full attention, and he noticed that she stood and sat at the appropriate moments and mouthed the hymns but did not sing them, and he noticed that no one sat beside her, and he noticed that the women around her were friendly but in the shallow, glancing way of people who are being friendly at a distance, careful not to get too close to something that hurt. He understood this. He had lost his own mother to fever when he was 15, and he remembered the particular way the community had treated his family in the aftermath, the covered dishes, and the genuine sympathy that nevertheless retreated steadily, until it was gone and they were left with the loss itself, and the absence of all the hands that had briefly reached toward them. Grief was uncomfortable for the people who were not inside it. It required things of them, sitting still with something unresolvable, and most people found that harder than they liked to admit. He did not speak to her after church that first Sunday, but he nodded as they filed out past each other in the doorway, and she nodded back, and this time the suggestion of a smile was slightly more definite than it had been in the market. It was a neighbor of Maria's, old Mr. Pratt, who inadvertently made the introduction formal. He was 80 years old and had a garden that was his great pride, and a fence line that was falling down, and no sons left alive to help him with it. And Isaiah had been walking past on an early April morning when he had stopped to help without being asked, which was the kind of thing Isaiah did without thinking about it, the automatic helpfulness of a man who sees what is needed and does it. Pratt had been so grateful that he had talked without stopping for 45 minutes, which was how Isaiah had ended up learning that the widow bishop next door had been the one fixing the old man's fence herself on her own spare mornings, until the work had gotten too heavy for her, and that she brought him soup when she made it, and that she was, in Mr. Pratt's opinion, a better person than Caldwell deserved. The next morning, Maria came out of her back door to find Isaiah Walker already at the fence, and she stopped on her back step and looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Pratt told you," she said. "He did," Isaiah said. He was working a new post into the ground with the easy competence of a man who is comfortable with physical work, and he glanced at her over his shoulder. "He also told me you have been doing this yourself." "He is 80 years old," she said. "He is," Isaiah agreed, "stubborn as a post." "More stubborn than a post," she said. "A post goes in eventually. He is harder to move." This time the smile arrived more fully and it changed her face, and Isaiah turned back to the fence post to give her some privacy with it. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. She stood there for a moment longer and then she said, "I'll make coffee," and went back inside. And Isaiah finished the section of fence and came to the back door and sat on the step to drink the coffee she brought him. And that was the first time they sat in any kind of proximity together and talked about anything real. She sat on the step beside him, not close, a proper distance, but still beside him, which struck him as significant, and they talked about Mr. Pratt and about the fence and about the garden she was trying to get started now that the soil was finally warming, and she asked him about his land east of the creek, and he told her about the sod house and his plans for the cattle, and she listened in a way that was entirely attentive, and he had the sensation, which he had not had in a long time, of being heard. He came back 2 days later to finish the fence. He did not invent an excuse. He just came, and she brought coffee again, and they sat on the step again, and this time the conversation lasted longer and ranged further. She told him about Ohio, about her family there, her parents who were both gone now, a brother in Indiana she wrote to but rarely heard back from. She told him about how she and Thomas had come west in the spring of 1871 with more hope than practical sense, and had found more difficulties than they had anticipated, but had been building something good, she thought, before it was taken. She said this with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her eyes on the middle distance, and her voice was steady the whole time, and Isaiah did not look away from her, and did not offer her any of the particular reassurances that people offer when they are uncomfortable with grief. No, it was God's plan, and no, He is in a better place, and no, you are so strong. He simply said, "Tell me about him," and she blinked and looked at him sharply, as if this was unexpected. "Most people don't ask that," she said. "Most people are afraid of the answer," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was funny." People didn't always know that about him because he was serious in company, business serious, the way men are. But at home he was funny. He would make up terrible jokes and tell them with a completely straight face and then wait to see if I would laugh. She paused. "I always laughed." Isaiah nodded. He did not say anything, and he did not fill the silence that came after, and Maria sat inside that silence for a moment, and it was, she realized, the first time in 5 months that the silence after speaking of Thomas had felt anything other than simply empty. It still hurt, but it was a different quality of hurt, the kind that is attached to something real rather than floating without anchor. "He sounds like a good man," Isaiah said eventually. "He was," she said. "He was a very good man." They finished their coffee, and Isaiah went back to his land, and Maria went back inside to her laundry work. And that evening she sat at the kitchen table with a candle, and the small tin box that held Thomas's watch and his wedding ring and the 2 photographs they had taken. And she looked at them for a long time, and she did not cry. But the feeling inside her chest was different than it had been before, less like a stone, and more like something with edges that could be held. April moved into May, and the weather warmed, and the cattle drovers began coming through Caldwell again on the trail north, and the town took on its seasonal restlessness, the saloons busier, the street noisier, the general atmosphere of a place that was also temporarily a destination. Isaiah was working hard on his land, getting the sod house tight, breaking ground for a larger pen, acquiring more cattle in small, careful increments. He was building something with the same patient intention that Maria had noticed from the beginning, the quality of a man who knows what he wants and is willing to work toward it honestly. He found reasons to come to the west edge of town twice a week, sometimes 3 times. The reasons were often genuine: a question about where Griggs kept the good seed, a second pair of hands needed for a task he could technically have managed alone. Maria's kitchen garden was a serious enterprise, and she had a good instinctive knowledge of the land, and they began to have conversations about planting and soil that were substantive and interesting, and that made both of them feel, in different ways, more capable. She had opinions. She stated them plainly. He had opinions too, and stated his, and they did not always agree, and the disagreements were conducted with a mutual respect that made them feel more like a kind of pleasure than a difficulty. He noticed that she had begun to show small signs of emerging from the deepest part of her grief, not recovering from it, which was not the same thing, not moving past it or leaving it behind, but learning to carry it rather than be crushed by it. She was starting to look at the world again with something other than endurance. He saw the way she bent over a new green shoot in her garden with a focused pleasure. He saw the way she laughed at Mr. Pratt's particular brand of elderly humor, a real laugh, not a polite one. He was careful not to put too much of his own feeling into these observations, because he was a man who was scrupulous about the line between what he wanted to see and what was actually there. But the feeling was there. He could not pretend otherwise, not to himself at least. It had arrived the way honest things arrive, without announcement, without his permission, simply present one morning when he woke up and found that his first thought was of how Maria's face had looked in the evening light the previous day, when she had described the way Thomas used to name all of their chickens, small ridiculous names, and how she had said this while almost laughing and then catching herself, and how Isaiah had said, "It seems like a reasonable thing to do," and she had actually laughed then. And the sound of it had been like water after a dry season. He kept his feeling to himself. She was a widow of 7 months. She was still wearing black. She had not given him any indication that she thought of him as anything other than a neighbor who was kind, and kindness was not courtship, and he was not the kind of man to presume. The town noticed, of course, because small towns notice everything. Mrs. Harmon mentioned to 3 separate people that the new man, Walker, had been seen at the widow Bishop's back fence on a number of mornings. The banker's wife raised an eyebrow. Reverend Holt's wife, who was kinder than most, said she thought it was nice that someone was looking in on Maria because she did worry about the woman. The consensus of Caldwell's female social network seemed to be a mixture of cautious approval and the particular watchfulness that communities direct toward widows who show signs of having ongoing lives. Maria was aware of this attention and was indifferent to it in a way that was almost noble. She had grown past the point of managing other people's perceptions of her grief. She was managing her own grief, which was a full-time occupation. One evening in late May, Isaiah was at her back step later than usual, having helped her carry the heavy washtubs in from the yard, and they were both sitting with the last of the coffee as the light went gold and long over the Kansas plain, and the air had the particular soft quality of a spring evening that is almost too beautiful to bear. Maria had her hands wrapped around her cup, and she was looking at the light on the horizon, with an expression that Isaiah had learned to read as the particular expression of someone who is experiencing something beautiful and sad simultaneously. The beauty of the world pressing up against the absence of someone who would have appreciated it with her. "He would have liked evenings like this," she said. "Tell me," Isaiah said. She looked at him. "You always say that," she said. "Because I always mean it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He would have sat here and made up a story about every cloud on the horizon. He had a whole mythology of clouds, a whole cast of characters. The tall one was always a general of some kind, always making bad decisions." She smiled, and it was a full smile this time, unguarded. "He made me laugh every single evening for 3 years, and I never once told him properly how much it meant." "You didn't have to," Isaiah said. "Laughing is telling." She looked at him again, and this time the look was different, more direct, more searching, as if she was trying to see something clearly. "You are a strange man, Isaiah Walker," she said, but she said it with warmth. "Strange how?" he asked. "You sit with things," she said. "Most people run from the hard things. You just sit right down in them." He looked out at the horizon. "Running doesn't move the thing," he said. "It just moves you." She absorbed this in silence, and then she said, "I've been sitting in this alone for 7 months." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for that." "You're the only one who has actually sat down in it with me," she said, and the words came out with a plainness that was clearly unguarded, a thing said from the inside out rather than the outside in, and she seemed to recognize this herself, because she looked slightly startled by her own honesty, and then she did not take it back. Isaiah did not fill the moment with more words. He let it exist, let it be what it was, which was one person telling another person something real. After a while he said, "How are you?" Not "How are you managing?" "How are you?" No one had asked her that. Not in the way he was asking, which was the way of someone who genuinely wanted the answer and was prepared to hold it carefully. She felt the question move through her like something physical, like warm water, and she took a slow breath before she answered. "Some mornings I wake up and the first half-second is fine," she said. "And then I remember, and it is like the very first morning all over again." She paused. "But the half-second is getting slightly longer, so I suppose that is something." "That is a great deal," he said. She looked down at her coffee cup. "I feel guilty about that, about the half-second getting longer. As if forgetting, even for a moment, is something I owe him an apology for." "You don't," he said. "Living isn't a betrayal of the dead, it's what they would want." "You sound very certain," she said. "I lost my mother when I was 15, he said, "and I spent years feeling guilty for every moment I was not actively grieving her, Every moment of happiness felt like a sin against her memory. And then one day, I realized that what I remembered most about her was how much she wanted me to be happy. That was the whole of what she wanted from me. And grieving myself into a shell was the one thing she would have hated most. Maria was looking at him with an attention that was total, the way you look at something you are only now seeing for what it really is. "I didn't know you had lost someone," she said. "We don't often tell people," he said. "We carry it privately." "Yes," she said softly, "we do." The light had gone from gold to rose on the horizon, and the evening star was becoming visible above the dark edge of the plain, and they sat together in the quiet in a way that was no longer simply neighborly, though neither of them said so. They were not so different, the two of them. They had each been alone inside something that could not be shared by general announcement, and they had each been managing it with a quiet competence that looked, from the outside, like fine, and was, from the inside, the hardest thing either of them had ever done. When he left that evening, he paused at the edge of her yard and turned back. "I'm glad you're here, Maria," he said, and he used her given name for the first time, and they both heard it. "I'm glad you're here too, Isaiah," she said, and she used his the same way. He walked back to his land in the long Kansas twilight with his hands in his coat pockets and something settled and warm in his chest. And he did not call it hope, because he was too careful for that. But it was the nearest thing to hope he had felt in a long time. June arrived in Caldwell with heat and cattle and the full summer energy of the trail town. The drovers came through in long, dusty lines, the longhorns bawling and pressing against each other, the cowboys tired and weathered and looking for a meal and a drink, and the company of people who were not cows. Isaiah knew some of these men from his years on the trail, and he spent a few evenings at the saloon's back room reacquainting himself with familiar faces, trading information about the trail and the markets and the general condition of things south. It was good to see these men, but it also confirmed something he had been feeling for some time, which was that he was done with the trail. The life he was building east of the creek felt right in a way the trail had never quite felt. The way you feel when you stop moving and realize that what you were moving toward was not a destination, but a disposition. The particular settledness of being in a place and making it yours. He told Maria about this one afternoon, while she was helping him identify which of his cattle had the beginning of a hoof problem that needed attention, because she had grown up on a farm in Ohio and knew cattle, and he had asked her opinion in good faith. She was crouched in the pen without any concern for her dress, examining the animal with the practical hands-on manner of a woman who had learned useful things and saw no reason to pretend she had not. "You're not going back on the trail," she said, and it was not a question. "No," he said, "I'm done with it." "Good," she said, and then looked up at him with an expression that was briefly unguarded, as if she had said more than she meant to, and then she looked back at the cow's hoof. "This one needs a poultice and dry bedding for 3 days. I can show you how to mix it." "I know how to mix a poultice," he said. "Then why did you ask me to come look?" she asked. "Because I wanted your company," he said. He said it plainly without apology, and she went very still for just a moment, crouched there in the cattle pen, and then she stood and brushed her hands on her apron and looked at him directly. "Isaiah," she said. "I know," he said. "Do you? You are still in black," he said. "You are still in the grief. I'm not asking anything of you. I want to be clear about that. I just want you to know that my wanting your company is real, and you should know it's real so you can decide how you feel about it." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with that measuring expression that he had come to know, the one that meant she was deciding something carefully. The sun was high and hot, and the cattle made their low sounds, and the flies droned, and the world was entirely ordinary around them. And in the middle of this ordinary world, something was being said that was not ordinary at all. "I'm not sure how I feel," she said finally. "But I'm not opposed to knowing." He nodded once. "That's enough," he said. He did not press. He was not built for pressing. He continued to come to her fence and her back step and her market trips when their schedules aligned. and he continued to sit with her in the evenings when the light was long, and the conversation was real, and he continued to ask her to tell him about Thomas, which she did, and he continued to listen. And what was happening between them was not the sudden dramatic thing of songs, but the slower and more lasting thing of two people learning the specific shape of each other's character and finding it good. In July, she stopped wearing black every day. She had one gray dress that she had brought from Ohio that had been a half-mourning color before she had worn full mourning, and she began alternating it with the black. And Isaiah noticed, but did not comment because it was her choice and her timing, and not something that required commentary. But he noticed it the way you notice a window being opened in a room that has been closed. Reverend Holt's wife, a woman named Charlotte who was one of the genuinely good people of Caldwell, came to call on Maria that month and sat in the small front parlor and had tea and said, as directly as she was able to, that she thought Maria Bishop was a remarkable woman, and that she hoped Caldwell had been adequate company through her grief. And Maria had said with characteristic composure that people had been kind, and Charlotte Holt had said, "That is a generous way to put it." And Maria had almost smiled and said, "It is the honest one." And Charlotte had left feeling that she had failed to say the thing she came to say, which was that the woman deserved more than Caldwell had given her and that she hoped she was finding it somewhere. She was. She was finding it in a sod house east of the creek on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and on certain golden evenings, finding it in a man who asked how she was and meant it, who wanted to know about the man she had loved and lost, who sat down in the grief with her instead of standing at the door waiting for it to be over. She was finding it in conversations that went from practical things to true things in the seamless way that happens when two people have a compatible quality of mind and a mutual willingness to be honest. She was finding it in the way she felt when she heard Copper's hooves on the road outside and knew he was coming, a feeling she had not allowed herself to name yet, but that was warm and definite. On a Thursday afternoon in early August, a cattle drover from Texas named Crane came through Caldwell with a large herd and stopped for supplies and whiskey. And in the course of his whiskey consumption, he became the particular kind of difficult that large men become when they have had too much, and the world has not been going their way. He was at the general store when Maria was there, and he made a remark to her that was not appropriate, the kind of remark that men who see women alone assume they are permitted to make. And Maria had gone very still and very cold in the way she had of containing things within herself, and she had said in a voice of absolute controlled ice, "You will address me properly or not at all." And Crane had been briefly surprised, and then had taken a step toward her with the intention of making the encounter worse. Isaiah had walked in at that exact moment to pick up the nails he had ordered. He assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, the way of a man who had spent years on the trail learning to read the temperature of rooms quickly, and he placed himself between Maria and Crane with a natural easiness that did not look like a threat and was entirely a threat. He said nothing immediately. He just stood there, and the quality of his stillness was the kind that large amounts of violence have the tendency to produce in a man who has learned to be very calm before them. "Is there a problem here?" Griggs asked from behind the counter because he could read a room too. "No problem," Isaiah said pleasantly, and looked at Crane with those still dark eyes. Crane was a big man, but he was not a stupid one, not entirely, and he made the calculation that the man in front of him was the kind of quiet trouble that was worse than loud trouble, and he made his purchase and left, and the bell above the door jangled behind him. Maria was looking at Isaiah. She had composed herself with her usual efficiency, but her hands were not perfectly steady, and he saw that. "Come on," he said, and he did not say it with any particular drama, just with the plain decision of a man who has decided, and she followed him out of the general store and they walked back to her house in the afternoon heat, and she sat down at her kitchen table, and he put the kettle on because he had learned where she kept everything, and he made tea and brought it to the table and sat across from her. "Are you all right?" he asked. I'm fine, she said, and then, because he was Isaiah and she had learned by now that fine was not an answer he accepted as a complete sentence, she said, I was frightened. Not at the end, but at the beginning, before he knew I wasn't going to simply absorb it. I was frightened. That's a sensible response to that situation, he said. I hate being frightened, she said. Most people do, he said. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you a person. She looked at him across the table. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay in stripes across the floor, and the tea was hot and the room was familiar to him now. The blue willow pattern on the cups and the dried herbs hanging from the beam and the small framed photograph of Thomas on the shelf by the window that she had put there deliberately because she believed in not hiding the things that were true. Isaiah, she said. Maria, he said. I don't know what I'm doing, she said. With this. I don't know what this is, and I don't know if I'm ready for it to be anything, and I don't know if I am being fair to you by letting it continue to be ambiguous. You don't have to know yet, he said. I'm not in a hurry. But you deserve, she started. I deserve whatever you are genuinely able to give, he said. And what you are genuinely able to give right now is coffee on a back step and a good conversation and the company of someone who doesn't bore me, which is more than most people manage. I'm not suffering, Maria. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the town went on with its summer business, the horses on the street and the sound of the saloon piano starting up in the early evening heat and the cattle somewhere to the south. Inside the kitchen, the afternoon was very still. Tell me something about yourself, she said. Something you haven't told me yet. He thought for a moment. I can't read very well, he said. I mean, I can read, but slowly. I never had much schooling. I have been teaching myself from whatever I can get my hands on, but it goes slowly still. She looked at him with an expression that was entirely without judgment. I can read well, she said. My mother was a school teacher. She taught me before I could walk practically. I know, he said. Mr. Pratt told me you read to him on Thursday afternoons. He has trouble with his eyes now, she said. I know, Isaiah said, and then slowly, because it cost him something, I would be glad of someone to read to me, if you were ever willing. I'm better with information that's spoken than written. I learn things more easily when they're said aloud. The willingness in this, the willingness to name a limitation without embarrassment, struck Maria with a force that was disproportionate to its plainness, and she understood why, because it was the same quality she had seen in him from the beginning, the willingness to simply be what he was without performing otherwise. She had thought this admirable from a distance. She was realizing now that it was something more than admirable. It was the rarest quality she had ever encountered. Yes, she said, I would be very willing. Yes. And that was how Thursday afternoons became the reading hour, with Maria sitting in the better chair by the window and Isaiah on the straight-back chair across from her, with his hat on the floor, and his eyes closed, and his whole attention on her voice as she read from whatever she could borrow from the small lending library that Charlotte Holt had established in the vestry of the church. She read him history, and she read him accounts of agriculture, and she read him, when she was feeling bold, poetry, and he listened to all of it with the same quality of complete attention that he gave to everything else. And these hours became something she looked forward to with an intensity that she no longer tried to analyze. August burned itself out and September came in cooler, and the drovers were on the last leg of the season now, the big late herds pushing north before the weather turned them back, and Caldwell was loud and full, and then suddenly quiet again as the season closed, and what remained was the town's ordinary self, the people who lived there all year and knew each other's actual lives rather than the seasonal performance of them. On a Saturday morning in mid-September, Isaiah came to her gate, and she came out of the house still holding her morning coffee, and he said, I have something to show you. And she put on her boots and came with him without asking what it was, because she had learned that his instincts were reliable, and whatever he wanted to show her would be worth seeing. He took her east of the creek to his land, and she had been there before, had seen the sod house and the cattle pen and the broken ground for the new pen, but she had not been inside the sod house, and he opened the door and she stepped inside. He had been working on it. The walls were properly chinked now, and he had built a solid interior framing that made it feel like a structure rather than a burrow. And he had added a proper hearth and a chimney, and a window on the east wall that looked out over the creek and the grassland beyond, and the light came through it in the morning like a gift. It was small and it was modest and it was very clearly the beginning of something rather than the thing itself, but the care in it was evident, the serious attention of someone who is making a place to actually live. "You did all this yourself," she said. "Over the summer," he said. "I wanted it to be solid before the cold came." She stood in the middle of the space and turned slowly, looking at the ceiling, the walls, the window with the morning light in it. "It's good work," she said. "It's really good work." He was watching her look at it, and his expression was one that she had not seen before, something open and uncertain, which was unusual for him, and she turned to him and saw it and felt the answer to it somewhere behind her sternum. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the spring, about whether to build a proper frame house. Whether it makes sense to invest in that, whether I intend to stay here permanently. And," she said, "the answer to all three depends on things I don't yet know," he said. "On things I don't want to assume or rush." She looked at him. "Say what you mean," she said. He met her eyes. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to build the house. I want to build it for someone specific, and the someone specific is you, and I am aware that it may be too soon, and I am aware that you are still finding your footing, and I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. But I want you to know what I'm thinking about, because you deserve honesty, and I think you already know it anyway." The morning was very bright and very quiet, and the creek made its small sound through the window. And Maria Bishop stood in the middle of this sod house on a September morning in 1874, almost a year after she had buried Thomas, and she felt the whole interior architecture of herself rearranging, not replacing what had been, not erasing the shape of the love she had carried, but making room beside it for something new, which was the only honest thing that love can do when it comes the second time. "Isaiah," she said. "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She looked at the window and the light in it and then back at him. "I love Thomas entirely," she said. "I want to say that first because it is true and it will always be true, but I am alive, and you are the only person in this whole town who has made being alive feel like something other than just the continuation of loss." She stopped and then continued. "I am not there yet. I am not ready yet, but I am moving toward it, and I wanted you to know that the direction I'm moving is toward you." He was still. Then he crossed the small space between them and he took her hand carefully, as if it were something he was borrowing rather than taking, and he held it and did not do anything else, and she let him hold it, and the morning light came through the east window and lay on the floor between them, and the creek kept up its conversation with the stones. October came back, the anniversary month, and with it the particular anniversary grief that Maria had been dreading since August, the 1-year mark of Thomas's death. She spent the morning of October 4th, the day he had died, sitting in the kitchen with his photograph and his watch, and she wept for the first time since the funeral, wept properly, wholly, the way she had not permitted herself in a year of careful composure, and the grief was enormous and real, and she let it be enormous and real, and when it had moved through her like weather she felt on the other side of it something she had not expected, which was a kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of having truly honored the thing that had been taken. Isaiah came that afternoon, not having known about the anniversary specifically, but having known, in the way he knew things about her now, that the month was hard. He came to the door and she opened it with red eyes she did not attempt to hide, and he looked at her and said nothing, and she said, "Come in." And he came in and they sat at the kitchen table, and she told him everything, the whole year, all the mornings and the half-seconds and the laundry and the market and the loneliness that had been so total it had sometimes felt physical, like an actual weight on her shoulders. She told him things she had not told anyone, not the preacher, and not Mrs. Harmon, and not old Mr. Pratt, things that had been living inside her in the dark for a year, and he listened to all of it without looking away or filling the silences with reassurance, just listening the way he always listened, with every part of his attention. And when she was done, she felt something release in her chest that she had been holding for 12 months. He reached across the table and took her hands, both of them, and held them the way he had held the one hand in the sod house, carefully, with the quality of someone who knows what it is they are holding and is grateful for the trust of it. "You have been so strong," he said. "I had to be," she said. "You didn't," he said. "You chose to be." "That's different," she looked at him. "I'm tired of being strong alone," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't have to be alone anymore, not unless you want to." She turned her hands over in his and held them back, and this was the first time she held on to him instead of letting herself be held, and it meant something different, a direction rather than a reception, and he felt it and she felt him feel it, and they sat there at the kitchen table in October in the way of two people who have found the ground they were looking for. They did not rush the rest. It was not their nature, either of them. November was a month of continuing to discover each other, and the discovery was full and good and full of the small pleasures that courtship in the ordinary world consists of. The walks they took in the long-legged Kansas evenings when the air was cold and clean, the reading hours that had expanded to include history and philosophy, and once, memorably, a very long and somewhat ridiculous novel that made them both laugh repeatedly. The conversations over his fence and her step that ranged from the absolutely practical to the deeply personal, in the easy fluid way of two people who have stopped managing the distance between themselves. He told her about his years on the trail, not romanticizing them, telling them true, the difficulty and the beauty and the periodic violence and the long days that became years without your quite noticing. The way a life can happen to you if you don't stop long enough to decide what you want from it. He told her about the man he had worked for who had cheated his workers of wages, and how Isaiah had said so directly, and had been dismissed, and how he had sat with the injustice of that for a long time before understanding that the only power he had was to build his own thing on better terms. He told her about the Cherokee men he had worked alongside on the trail, men who were being squeezed from every direction by policies and politics that had nothing to do with fairness, and how he had learned more about endurance from these men than from anyone else he had known. And he said this with anger and sadness both, the anger of someone who has seen an injustice clearly and could not fix it. Maria listened to this with the same attention she gave to everything, and she said that she thought one person's honest witness to an injustice mattered even when it could not single-handedly change the outcome. And he agreed, and they were silent together for a moment with the weight of that truth. December arrived, and with it the cold and the particular beauty of the Kansas plain in winter, the sky a deep pale blue above the bleached grass, the creek running clear and cold over stones that looked like pewter in the winter light. Isaiah's land was quiet in the way of winter farmland, the cattle tended and settled, the heavy work waiting for spring, and he had more time now to come to the west edge of town, and he did. He came on a December evening with his hat in his hands and a small item in his coat pocket that had taken him 3 weeks to arrange, requiring a letter to a jeweler in Wichita and the anxiety of not knowing if it would arrive, and it had arrived that morning by way of the stage. He came to her door and she opened it with the warmth of her kitchen behind her and the smell of something baking and her hair coming loose from its pins in the way it did by evening, and she looked at him and said, "You look like you're about to say something that costs you," and he said, "I am," and she stepped back and let him in. They stood in her kitchen and he said, "Maria, I know this past year has been the hardest year of your life, and I know you are still carrying Thomas with you, and I know you will always carry him, and I am not asking you to put that down. I'm asking if there is room beside it for me. I am asking if you will build something with me. The house in the spring. A life. I am asking if you will marry me. She looked at him for a long time, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and the candle was burning on the table, and Thomas's photograph was on the shelf by the window, its place unmoved. And she felt the wholeness of her life, the grief and the love and the loss and the new thing growing beside it, all of it present and real and honest, and she said, "Yes, Isaiah, yes, I will." He brought the ring from his pocket, and it was a simple thing, a narrow gold band with a small garnet, because he had been told garnets were good and honest, and he had liked the color, deep red like something living. And he put it on her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it in the candlelight. And then she looked at him, and whatever was in her expression was something he intended to spend the rest of his life being adequate to. He kissed her for the first time right there in the kitchen, softly, carefully, the kind of first kiss that knows what it is and doesn't rush itself. And she kissed him back, and it was warm and real, and there was nothing in it of performance, only two people who had come through hard things to a good place and were acknowledging it. They told Reverend Holt the following Sunday. Charlotte Holt cried, which surprised everyone and shouldn't have, because Charlotte Holt had been hoping for exactly this. Mr. Pratt, when Maria told him, said, "Well, it took long enough," which was his way of saying he was pleased. Mrs. Harmon said she had known from the beginning, which was her way of saying she was pleased. The banker's wife said she was delighted for the widow Bishop, and managed, for the most part, to mean it. They set the wedding for late March of 1875, which would mark a year and a half since Thomas's death, which felt to Maria like the right amount of time, a full cycle of seasons, a year of learning to live again before beginning something new. She did not ask anyone's opinion on the timing, and no one volunteered one, or if they did it was not to her face, and she would not have listened if it had been. The winter between the engagement and the wedding was, improbably, one of the happiest periods of Maria Bishop's life, which surprised her and which she thought about carefully. She was still grieving. She would grieve Thomas forever in the way you grieve someone who was good and who you loved and who left too soon. But grief and happiness are not opposites. She understood this now in a way she had not known before. They coexist. They live in the same chest. And the happiness she was finding with Isaiah did not diminish the grief. It simply meant the grief no longer had to carry the whole weight of her interior life by itself. They built the house in the spring, as he had promised. The framing went up in April. A proper wood frame house with a front porch and 2 rooms that would eventually be 3, and a kitchen that was larger than the one in her small clapboard house. And Maria had opinions about the kitchen that she stated with the particular directness of a woman who intends to spend the majority of her time in it, and sees no reason to be coy about what she wants. He built it as she specified. He also added a window on the east wall of the bedroom without being asked, because he had noticed how much she liked morning light. They married on the 28th of March, 1875, in the white wooden church that was also a schoolhouse, and Charlotte Holt provided flowers from wherever Charlotte Holt produced flowers in late March in Kansas, which was a mystery to everyone. And Maria wore a blue dress, not black, not white, but blue, the color of a late afternoon sky, because she had decided that was the color of what she was doing, which was walking into something open and clear and full of light. Isaiah wore his best coat, which Mrs. Harmon had pressed for him, and his clean hat, and his particular quality of absolute stillness that, in this context, was the stillness of a man who is exactly where he wants to be and has no desire to be anywhere else. The ceremony was simple, and they said the words to each other with complete honesty. And when it was done, and Isaiah looked at her there in the afternoon light of the white wooden church, and she looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes that had been measuring the world since the day he had first seen her from the street, he felt the whole accumulated truth of the past year land in him, the patience of it, the slowness of the trust that had built between them, the sheer value of something that had not been rushed or forced, but had been allowed to grow at its own pace into something solid and real. They moved into the new house east of the creek on the 1st of April, which Mr. Pratt thought was very funny and said so at length, and the house smelled of new wood and the spring grass coming up through the window, and Maria put Thomas's photograph on the shelf in the parlor where it could be seen properly, in a place of honest honor, because Isaiah had said, "Put him where you can see him," and she had looked at him with an expression that was beyond gratitude, somewhere past it in the territory of deep recognition, and she had done exactly that. The spring was full of work. Isaiah's cattle herd was growing into something real now, 12 head with good stock among them, and the land was responding to his attention the way land does when someone works it with patience and knowledge. Maria's kitchen garden expanded to cover ground that had previously been unused, and she added chickens, and she named all of them, small ridiculous names, because Thomas had done it, and because life goes forward by carrying the good things with it. Isaiah laughed every single time she announced the name of a new chicken, and she told him, "Don't laugh, Henrietta takes it very seriously," and he laughed harder, and it was one of those ordinary moments that is also not ordinary at all. By summer she was expecting their first child, and she told him on a July evening on the front porch of the new house with the plain opening up before them in the long light, and his face did something entirely unguarded, a joy so complete and undefended that she reached up and put her hand against his cheek, and he covered her hand with his own, and they sat like that for a long time in the summer evening. The pregnancy was healthy. Isaiah drove her to town for Dr. Crane's appointments with a careful attentiveness that sometimes made her laugh, because he treated the wagon like it was made of fine crystal when she was in it, and she told him she was not fragile, and he said he knew that perfectly well and continued driving carefully. She felt strong and well through most of it, the particular vitality of a woman whose body is doing what it was made to do, and she worked the garden through September and into October, and said she was not stopping on account of a baby, and Isaiah did not argue with her because he had learned that arguing with Maria was a low-percentage proposition. Their son was born in February of 1876, in the bedroom of the house with the east window, which was as Maria had hoped, because she wanted to look at the morning light while it was happening, and she did. He was born at dawn, which felt right, a new thing arriving with the new light, and he was healthy and loud about it, which the doctor said was an excellent sign, and Isaiah held him for the first time with the same quality he brought to everything that mattered, the absolute careful attention of a man who knows what he's holding. They named him Thomas Isaiah Walker, Thomas first for the man Maria had loved and lost, Isaiah second for the man she had found in the aftermath of that loss, and the name was a complete sentence about the nature of love, how it does not replace but continues, how it is not diminished by addition but expanded. Young Thomas was, from the beginning, a person of strong opinions and excellent appetite, and a laugh that was his father's laugh in a small body, and the house east of the creek was full of the particular noise and warmth of a family in its early years, something that neither Maria nor Isaiah had been entirely certain was coming to them, and both of them were grateful for it with the specific gratitude of people who know how quickly things can be taken. The town of Caldwell was changing around them. The cattle trade was shifting, the railroads moving the terminus points north, and Caldwell was growing in some ways and shrinking in others. The saloon still busy, but the character of the town slowly evolving as more families settled, and the frontier moved further west. Isaiah had joined the Small Ranchers Association that had formed to deal with water rights and land boundary questions that came with the territory, and he was respected there for his plain speaking and his fair dealing. Maria had become Charlotte Holt's partner in the church library, which had grown into something real, and she had taken on the role of teaching reading to the few adults in the community who needed it, which she did without ceremony or condescension in the way of someone who believes absolutely in the value of what she is giving. When Thomas was 2, Charlotte Holt mentioned to Maria on a library afternoon that she had noticed something in the way Isaiah looked at Maria when she was not looking at him, and she said it was the kind of looking that a person does when they have the thing they were looking for and cannot quite believe their own luck. Maria had smiled and said, "He tells me," and Charlotte said, "That is very good of him," and Maria said, "He is a very good man." And the simplicity and completeness of this was something Charlotte Holt thought about for a long time afterward. In the fall of 1877, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara after Isaiah's mother, with Maria's dark eyes and Isaiah's stillness, a combination that would prove, as she grew, to be formidable. She was loud at first and then became the quiet, observant kind of child who sees everything and says little and surprises you regularly when she speaks. And Isaiah took one look at her in his arms and said, "She is going to be extraordinary." And Maria said, "She is 3 hours old." And Isaiah said, "It doesn't change the observation," and he was right. The house east of the creek was a full house now, warm in winter with the fire in the hearth and loud with children in summer. And the cattle herd had grown to the point that Isaiah had hired 2 hands to help, decent men he had known from the trail who were, like him, looking for something to settle into, and the operation was real and growing and honest. Mr. Pratt died in the spring of 1878 at 82 years old, in his bed in the night, without distress, and Maria sat with him in the days before when it was clear he was going and read to him, and he had said at one point, looking at her with the sharp eyes that had never dimmed, "You came through it, girl. You came through all the hard of it." And she had taken his hand and said, "I had help." He had smiled and said, "You had the sense to accept it. That's rarer." He was buried in the Caldwell cemetery with a service that was well attended, and Maria stood at the grave and felt the grief of it clearly and honestly, and Isaiah stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back, and she leaned into him slightly, and the grief was real and present, and she was not alone inside it. That evening at home, after the children were asleep, she and Isaiah sat on the front porch in the spring dark with the stars enormous above the plain, and she told him everything she had loved about Mr. Pratt, the whole of it, the stubbornness and the garden and the way he had seen her clearly from the beginning, and Isaiah listened and asked her to tell him more, which he always did, and she told him until she had told all of it, and then they sat in the quiet together for a long time. "Do you know what he said to me once?" Isaiah said. "What?" she asked. "He said that you were the most private grief he had ever seen, and that he hoped someone would come along who was patient enough to sit in it with you. He said he worried no one would." Isaiah paused. "He told me that in the second week I was here, before I had spoken to you more than twice." Maria was quiet. "He never said that to me," she said. "He probably thought you had enough to manage without knowing he was worried," Isaiah said. She looked at the stars. "He was right," she said. "I was very alone in it." "I know," Isaiah said. "I saw it." "What made you sit down in it with me?" she asked. "Instead of doing what everyone else did, watching from a distance, being kind from a distance." He thought about this honestly, as he thought about most things. "I recognized it," he said. "The particular way you hold yourself when the grief is very large and you are managing it entirely alone. My father had that quality after my mother died. I had it myself after my mother. That particular containment." He paused. "I knew what it was to be inside that and have everyone around you being kind at a distance, and I knew that the kindness from a distance doesn't help. It just confirms that you are alone in it." She turned to look at him in the dark. "Isaiah." "Maria," he said. "I love you," she said. "I want to make sure you know that I love you in the full sense of it, not the grateful sense, not the relieved sense, but the actual choosing sense, the you specifically sense." He turned to look at her, and in the faint starlight his eyes had that quality of still water, deep and calm and full of things that did not need to be performed. "I know," he said. "You show me." He reached over and took her hand. "And I love you in the same full sense of it, the you specifically sense." The spring night was soft around them, and the cattle were quiet in the pen, and somewhere an owl was conducting its business in the dark, and the new grass was coming in around the house that he had built for her with the east window in the bedroom, so she could see the morning light, and their children were sleeping inside, Thomas and Clara both, and the life that neither of them had been certain was coming had arrived complete and solid and good. They stayed on the porch until late, talking about things large and small in the fluid, effortless way of people who are deeply known to each other, planning the expansion of the herd, discussing the letter from Maria's brother in Indiana that had finally come after years of silence, wondering what Thomas would make of school when the time came, laughing about Clara's most recent observation, which had been delivered at the dinner table with the solemnity of a judge and had been surprisingly accurate. When they finally went inside and the candle was out and the house was dark and quiet, Maria lay with her head on Isaiah's shoulder in the way she had come to every night, the way that felt more like home than any geography she had ever occupied, and she thought about the years behind her, the grief that had been so enormous and so private, the town that had left her to it, the year she had spent inside it alone, and the morning that a man had walked past her fence and slowed down, and all the mornings that had followed. She had not known, in those first dark months, that grief was not a destination but a passage. She had not known that it was possible to carry the whole of a love you had lost and still have hands free for a new one. She had not known that the quality of being truly seen, being truly sat with, was as necessary to a person as water, and that going without it was a kind of slow diminishment that you did not notice clearly until it was remedied. Isaiah was awake beside her, she could tell by his breathing, and she said quietly into the dark, "Are you happy?" "I am," he said, and the simplicity and completeness of it was the best answer she had ever received to any question. "So am I," she said, and it was true. It was the whole truth, unambiguous and unhidden, the kind of happiness that has been built on honest ground and has room in it for everything, the grief and the joy and the past and the present, the man who was gone and the man who was here, the woman she had been alone in the winter of her loss, and the woman she had become on the other side of it, standing in blue in the church that was also a schoolhouse, and choosing something new with her whole self. Informed by everything she had been, and everything she had survived. She fell asleep with the sound of the Kansas plain outside the east window, the wind in the grass, the soft sounds of the cattle, the breathing of her husband beside her. And in the morning the light would come through that east window the way it always did, the way he had planned it, gold and full and warm on the floor between them, and she would wake into a life that had been built carefully and honestly, and with great love by two people who had both learned that sitting down in the hard things, rather than running from them, was the only way to find the good things waiting on the other side. Young Thomas and Clara would grow up on that land east of the creek, in the house with the front porch and the east window, surrounded by the particular richness of parents who loved each other with full knowledge of what love costs and what it is worth. They would grow up hearing their mother read aloud in the evenings, while their father listened with his eyes closed and his whole attention given over, and they would grow up knowing that Thomas Bishop's photograph lived in the parlor in a place of honored visibility, because love in their household was not a competition but a conversation across time, and honoring the past was not a threat to the present but a way of being honest about the complete shape of a life. They would grow up learning, by the daily example of their parents, that the best thing a person can do for another person who is in pain is not to stand outside the pain offering comfort from a safe distance, but to walk in and sit down and stay. In the summer of 1880, a full 5 years after they had married and 7 years after Thomas Bishop had gone into the ground on a bruise-colored October morning, Isaiah Walker stood on the porch of his house east of the creek in the long Kansas evening light with his son on his shoulders, and his daughter at his side, examining something in the grass with the intense focus of a child who has found a beetle, and he looked toward the lane where Maria was coming back from the market with the week's supplies in a basket. Her hair coming loose from its pins the way it always did by afternoon, and she looked up and saw him standing there with their children, and she stopped walking for just a moment, and the expression on her face was the one he had been building toward since the day he had first seen those shoulders against the laundry line, closed and carrying so much. The expression was open. It was entirely, openly, unguardedly happy. She walked up the lane and he reached down and took the basket from her, and she kissed him in the easy, familiar way of long marriage. And Thomas on his shoulders said, "Uh," which was his current position on displays of affection, and Clara said, "I found a beetle," which was her current position on everything else, and Maria laughed, and the laugh was the same sound it had always been, the sound he had first heard in the kitchen over a conversation about named chickens. Warm and real and entirely unperformed, and the evening light lay gold over the Kansas plain, and the cattle moved in the distance, and the creek made its sound through the grass, and the house stood solid and full and honest at the end of the lane, and everything was, in the truest sense of the word, complete.